In every age, power leaves behind ghosts, not spirits that wander palaces, but legacies that cling to blood. For centuries, monarchs ruled by divine right, their crowns forged not of gold, but of belief. Yet belief is fragile, and when belief dies, empires follow. The 20th century began with the thunder of engines and the whisper of revolt. Across Europe, the old world was cracking. Kings still signed decrees with diamond pens, but their empires were rotting from within. Factories rose where cathedrals once stood. The people, once silent, began to speak. And what they said was simple: we will no longer kneel. From St. Petersburg to Vienna, from Paris to Belgrade, the thrones of Europe trembled. The age of monarchs was ending, and most did not see it coming. For the royal families, it was unimaginable. They had been taught that God himself had placed them above all others. But history has no pity for tradition. It moves like ice, slow, unstoppable, indifferent. In Russia, the Romanovs ruled over a sixth of the earth. In Austria, the Habsburgs stitched together a mosaic of kingdoms. In Germany, the Kaisers dreamed of conquest. And in Britain, the Windsors watched with growing fear as the old order collapsed around them. The first to fall were those who refused to see. Nicholas II of Russia clung to faith and family while revolution gathered outside his gates. He believed loyalty could not be broken. He believed the people would never turn on their Tsar. He was wrong. In 1917, the revolution came not as a mob, but as a tide. It swept through cities and fields alike, and by the time it receded, the Romanovs were gone. Their rule ended in abasement, with bullets and silence. But Russia was not alone. Within a year, empires that had lasted for centuries vanished like smoke. The German Kaiser fled. The Habsburg Emperor was forced to abdicate. The Ottoman Caliphate crumbled into dust. The world awoke to find the crowns of Europe lying in the mud. The newspapers declared the death of royalty. But death, in history, is rarely final. In exile, something stirred, because bloodlines do not vanish when crowns do. They endure quietly, in safe houses, in abbeys, in the faded memory of names. And as the old monarchies died, their heirs began to scatter like seeds on the wind.
Some fled to Switzerland, carrying diamonds sewn into the hems of their clothes. Others vanished into monasteries or slipped aboard ships bound for America. They were stripped of title and power, but not of heritage. And though the world no longer bowed to them, they could never forget who they were. The exiled kings learned new trades. Some became merchants, others diplomats. They changed their names, their passports, their accents. But beneath the disguise, the blood remained the same. Thick with history, heavy with memory. And in that blood lingered a question. If monarchy was truly dead, why did so many still dream of it? Because for all its cruelty, monarchy was also theater, a performance of permanence in a world that changes too quickly. People need stories of power that never end. And so even after the palaces were emptied, the myths endured. They whispered of hidden heirs, of lost princes smuggled away in the night, of daughters married in secret to preserve the line. Some of those whispers were lies, some were not. When the Habsburgs fell, Austria declared itself free of emperors. Yet within a year, Otto von Habsburg, a boy of 6, was being tutored as the future king of nowhere. He would grow up wandering through Europe's ruins, carrying the memory of a vanished crown like a relic. When Italy overthrew its monarchy, King Umberto II took refuge in Portugal, still dressed in uniform, still signing letters, His Majesty. He died in exile, but his children married quietly into other dynasties, keeping the lineage unbroken. Even in France, where kings had lost their heads a century earlier, royalists gathered in secret salons. They debated which descendant of the Bourbons had the purer claim. They toasted to a monarchy that no longer existed, as if belief alone could resurrect it. Meanwhile, in Britain, the House of Windsor survived not by strength, but by adaptation. They abandoned divine right and embraced public image. They turned royalty into performance.
a spectacle broadcast across the world. And by doing so, they transformed survival into a kind of immortality. But the Windsors were not the only ones who endured. Far from London's cameras, other dynasties persisted in silence. In small villages of France, in remote corners of Spain, in forgotten towns of the Balkans, there lived people who bore names that history had erased, names that once commanded armies and built empires. And though they lived ordinary lives, the blood that ran through them was anything but ordinary. Some of them knew their ancestry, others did not. But records, letters, and private archives would later reveal that the line of monarchs never truly ended. It merely went underground. Imagine for a moment a farmer in Hungary whose great-grandmother was a Habsburg princess, or a teacher in Lisbon descended from an exiled Bourbon, or a young woman in Canada who discovers her DNA links her to the Romanovs. Such stories sound like myths, yet many are true. Because when empires fall, bloodlines hide. They intermarry, blend, and wait. They survive in the shadows until the world forgets to look. And so, even as the 20th century marched forward, the royal gene pool did not vanish. It merely dissolved into the masses, invisible yet alive. The crowns were gone, but the blood remained. It would take decades, and the invention of DNA science, to uncover just how far those bloodlines had spread. But the truth was already written in faces, in mannerisms, in habits passed down unknowingly. The old world still lived in fragments, buried within the new. Every era believes it is the first to escape the past. Every generation thinks it has broken the chain. Yet somehow, the chain always reforms. A surname changes, an accent softens, a coat of arms fades, but the blood remembers. It is history's quiet rebellion, and as wars came and went, the descendants of kings lived and died as ordinary citizens. They walked unnoticed through cities their ancestors once ruled. They paid taxes to governments their forefathers had created. They queued at post offices, voted in elections, and tucked their lineage away like a dangerous secret. Some did it out of shame, others out of safety, and some out of strategy, because there were those who believed that one day the world would tire of democracy and long again for the stability of kings. Those who believed monarchy was not dead, only sleeping. They formed societies, foundations, and private orders, not to reclaim power, but to preserve identity. They kept archives, portraits, and rings passed down from coronations long forgotten. And when the Cold War ended, when borders opened and secrets thawed, those archives began to speak again. What they revealed was astonishing. Hidden marriages between exiled royals and aristocrats, unacknowledged children born in foreign lands, secret funding networks designed to protect dynastic wealth, and letters that spoke of a future where bloodlines might one day rise again, not as rulers, but as influencers in a world driven by legacy. For bloodlines never disappear, they adapt. By the 21st century, the crowns that once gleamed under torchlight now shimmered through screens. Influence had become the new throne. Fortune replaced divine right. And yet, at the center of global power, you could still find traces of the same families who once ruled by crown and sword. They no longer called themselves kings, but they sat on boards, in parliaments, in silent circles of finance and culture. And their ancestors would have recognized the pattern instantly. Power had changed its form, but not its blood. In our time, the symbols of monarchy, the scepter, the crown, the throne, are museum relics. But the essence of monarchy, inheritance, exclusivity, legacy, still defines much of the modern world. Perhaps that is why we remain fascinated by royal families. They remind us that beneath all our progress, we still believe in lineage. We still crave continuity. We still want someone to carry the myth forward. The world may have buried its kings, but it never buried its hunger for royalty. And somewhere, in quiet houses and hidden estates, that royalty still breathes. When a kingdom falls, its gold can be melted, its palaces looted. But blood cannot be conquered. And so, as revolutions tore through Europe, the fallen royals carried with them the only treasure that mattered, their lineage. Their crowns were gone, but their blood still whispered of power. And in the decades that followed, that whisper became a secret, one spoken only behind closed doors. They called it the Exile years, a time when kings became wanderers and queens became ghosts. The world forgot their faces, but history never truly loses track of its children. The flight of the forgotten kings. In the spring of 1919, a train crossed the Austrian border under the cover of night. Inside were the remnants of an empire. Empress Zita of Bourbon-Parma, her 8 children, and a few loyal servants. Her husband, Charles, the last emperor of Austria-Hungary, had died the year before, coughing blood into his handkerchief, whispering prayers for a crown he would never wear again. The train was unmarked. No guards, no fanfare, only silence and fear. They were fleeing their own people, the same ones who once called them divine. And as the iron wheels carried them toward Switzerland, Zita pressed her children close and said softly, "Remember who you are, even when the world forgets." Those words became a prophecy. Across Europe, the children of dethroned monarchs were raised not as princes, but as shadows. They lived under false names, attended public schools, and learned to blend in. Yet in private, they were taught the rituals of royalty, the histories, the bloodlines, the codes of conduct passed down like sacred scripture. It was as if 2 worlds existed at once. The world of modernity, loud and new, and the world of memory, quiet, ancient, and unbroken. The hidden households. In a villa outside Madrid, a woman named Maria pretended to be an ordinary widow. She spent her days tending roses, writing letters, and hosting modest tea gatherings. But her name was not Maria. She was Maria Teresa of Bourbon II Sicilies, descendant of the oldest ruling house in southern Italy. Her title had been erased by revolution, her estates confiscated, her portrait removed from the walls of Naples. Yet in her home, she kept one painting, hidden behind a curtain. It showed a golden crown resting on a velvet cushion. No one was allowed to see it. To outsiders, she was a recluse. To insiders, she was the keeper of a forgotten throne. There were dozens like her, exiled nobles scattered like ashes after a fire. Some settled in quiet corners of Europe. Others crossed oceans to South America or the United States. They changed names to survive. De Bourbon became Dubois, von Habsburg became Habert, Romanov became Roman. And though the crowns were gone, the hierarchies remained. At gatherings in Paris or Lisbon, exiled royals still ranked each other by pedigree, tracing their lineages over dinner like soldiers recounting battles. They were kings without kingdoms, yet they clung to formality as if it were oxygen. Every signature carried a flourish. Every greeting included a bow. They were determined that the fall of empires would not mean the fall of identity. The Blood Pact. In 1927, in a quiet corner of Geneva, representatives of several royal families met under false names. No press, no guards, only trust and secrecy. There, they formed an agreement, a blood pact of sorts, to protect their descendants and preserve records of lineage. They agreed that each family would keep private archives, birth certificates, letters, marriage contracts, and heirlooms that could one day verify identity. If ever the time came when monarchy might return, these archives would prove their claim. Some called it foolish nostalgia. Others called it foresight. But one thing was certain. Even in exile, the royals refused to vanish. Those records would one day become the key to rediscovering lost heirs, long after their names had faded from history books. Children of the lost thrones. The children of exiled royals grew up between worlds. In public, they were taught humility. In private, they were told they were chosen. Imagine being 10 years old, attending school in Switzerland, while your parents whisper that you are the rightful heir to an empire that no longer exists. Imagine being told that your blood carries the weight of centuries, but that you must never speak of it. Such was the life of Otto von Habsburg, the boy emperor who never reigned. He grew up watching photographs of his coronation that never happened, learning the history of lands he could never claim. Yet even without a throne, he carried himself like a monarch. He studied law, politics, and diplomacy, believing that one day his family's honor would be restored. And in a way, it was. Otto became a member of the European Parliament, a quiet, symbolic return to influence. Not as emperor, but as architect of a new Europe. It was as though history had bent itself in his favor, granting him a new throne, built not of marble but of ideas. Elsewhere, other royal children made different choices. Some married into wealthy families to preserve their status. Others rejected their heritage entirely, choosing lives of anonymity. But even those who denied their blood could never escape it completely. It lingered in their posture, their eyes, the subtle authority in their voice. A legacy written not in ink, but in DNA. Across the ocean. Not all exiled royals remained in Europe. Some sought refuge across the Atlantic, in places where no one cared about kings or crowns. In 1920s America, a man named Michael Romanov opened a restaurant in Beverly Hills. He claimed to be a Russian prince, a cousin of the Tsar himself. Hollywood adored him. Actors, producers, and writers dined beneath chandeliers while Prince Romanov told stories of palace life. Later, journalists discovered his real name was Harry Gergeson, a tailor's son from Lithuania. A fraud, perhaps. But the irony was that his restaurant became the most exclusive royal court Hollywood had ever known. And among his guests were genuine descendants of royalty, exiled nobles drawn to the illusion of status. In his dining room, the myth of monarchy found a new stage. Across South America, other stories unfolded. In Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, royal families quietly rebuilt their lives under new names. The Portuguese royal line found refuge there. Some descendants still live in São Paulo today. They became business owners, philanthropists, professors, pillars of society who never spoke of their ancestry. But their family records tell another story, one of adaptation, resilience, and quiet power. The royal web. By mid-century, exile had woven a web across continents. Royal bloodlines intertwined with industrial families, banking dynasties, and political elites. Some of these unions were strategic, ways to preserve influence without attracting attention. Others were simply acts of survival. But over time, the lines blurred. The descendants of kings married the children of financiers and diplomats. And from those unions emerged a new kind of aristocracy, not crowned but connected. To the untrained eye, they were ordinary citizens. To historians, they were living relics, bridges between the world that was and the world that is. By the 1970s, it was estimated that more than 800 individuals across Europe could trace direct lineage to dethroned monarchs. Some knew it proudly, some had no idea. But every decade, a few surfaced, through memoirs, DNA tests, or family revelations. One woman in France discovered she was descended from the last king of Portugal after finding a letter hidden in her grandmother's Bible. A man in Canada, adopted as a child, traced his ancestry to a lost branch of the Habsburgs through mitochondrial DNA. And in Russia, where the Romanovs had long been declared extinct, distant relatives reappeared with names that sounded almost invented. Romanova, Nikolaevich, Petrovna. But their genetics told the truth. The royal line had survived. The weight of legacy. What is it like to carry a bloodline? To know that your ancestors ruled nations and you rule nothing at all? For some, it is a curse. The expectations, the comparisons, the invisible pressure to live up to ghosts. For others, it is a quiet strength, a reminder that survival itself is victory. A few exiled royals tried to reclaim power. Most failed, but many found ways to influence the world from the shadows. A forgotten prince might run a foundation. A descendant of czars might advise governments. A duke's great-grandson might control an international bank. Power had changed its clothes, but it still spoke the same language. The silent return. As the Cold War ended, Archives opened. Old secrets thawed. In Vienna, letters sealed for decades revealed the hidden lives of exiled heirs. In Paris, diaries detailed marriages arranged in secret to preserve bloodlines. And in Russia, archaeologists uncovered remains that reignited the question, did any of the Romanovs truly survive? DNA answered part of the question, but not all. Because for every confirmed grave, there was another rumor, another name, another photograph that didn't quite fit. It seemed impossible, yet the pattern persisted. Royal bloodlines never truly die. They scatter. They adapt. They hide in plain sight. By the end of the 20th century, the monarchies of Europe had shrunk from empires to tourist attractions. Yet behind the ceremonies and tabloids, the real legacy of royalty had transformed. The new crown was influence. The new kingdom, global. Legacy, without thrones. It is easy to think of monarchy as a relic, but monarchy was never only about crowns. It was about continuity, a belief that some lines must never break. Even today, the descendants of fallen monarchs remain woven into the tapestry of modern society. They are CEOs, ambassadors, writers, and scholars. Their faces may not appear on coins, but their stories still shape culture and identity. And perhaps that is the truest form of royalty. Not one that rules by decree, but one that survives by memory. Because history has a peculiar habit of returning to the names it once erased, and every time it does, it reminds us that power never disappears. It only changes its disguise. The story of royalty should have ended long ago. The crowns have tarnished, the palaces turn to museums, and the portraits of kings hang as relics of another age. And yet, somehow, the idea of royal blood refuses to die. It flows quietly beneath the surface of our modern world, unseen, but not gone. Even now, there are those who carry the mark of ancient power. They do not wear crowns, nor do they command armies, but they move through life with the gravity of history in their veins. They are the heirs of empires, living among us, often without even knowing who they are. The living descendants today, more than 24 royal families still exist in some form. Britain, Spain, Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, each still has a monarch, though stripped of divine right. Their power lies not in politics, but in symbolism, the ability to embody continuity in a restless world. But beyond those visible thrones lies a deeper, quieter network, one built on bloodlines, not titles. Descendants of fallen dynasties now live as ordinary people, teachers, bankers, actors, and even politicians. They walk among the rest of us, their history hidden beneath modern clothes and ordinary names. The Romanovs, once thought extinct, have more than 30 confirmed descendants alive today. Some still live in Europe, others in America. One is an artist in New York. Another works for the United Nations. They carry no royal privileges, only a sense of lineage that history can't quite erase. The Habsburgs, too, are scattered across continents. Karl von Habsburg, a direct descendant of the last emperor, serves as an advocate for cultural preservation. He once said, "We no longer wear crowns, we protect heritage." It was a simple statement, but it revealed something profound. The bloodline had evolved from ruling lands to guarding memory. Royalty in disguise. In our modern age, bloodlines no longer declare themselves. They hide. And in hiding, they have become something more subtle. Influence without visibility. A man attending a board meeting in London may be a descendant of the French Bourbons. A woman giving a lecture in Berlin may trace her roots to the Polish kings. In Switzerland, a banker's surname links quietly to the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. None wear their lineage openly. They don't need to, because power today no longer comes from recognition. It comes from legacy, from networks of trust, old money, and ancient ties that still bind. Even marriages among the wealthy and influential often echo old royal patterns, unions of families with long histories made not for love, but for continuity. Modern elites may not call themselves monarchs, but they behave like them. And the blood that once ruled nations now circulates through boardrooms and parliaments. The royal game never ended. It simply changed its stage. The science of bloodlines. In the 21st century, DNA became the new crown. Where once ancestry was proven by parchment and seal, now it is measured by strands of genetic code. When scientists sequenced the Romanov remains in the 1990s, they didn't just confirm a tragedy. They opened a door. They found living relatives scattered across the world, some unaware of their connection to Russia's last Tsar. For the first time, blood itself became the historian. Since then, genealogical research has revealed astonishing links. Nearly half of Europe's population can trace ancestry, however distant, to medieval monarchs. Millions carry fragments of royal DNA, diluted through centuries, yet still traceable. Even outside Europe, migrations, marriages, and colonial expansions spread royal genes far and wide. You could pass someone in a cafe or look in a mirror and never realize that your blood once sat on a throne. Royal blood no longer belongs to the few. It has merged with the many, and in doing so, it has achieved the one thing monarchs always claimed to desire: immortality. The quiet power of legacy. Even stripped of crowns, royal descendants often hold positions of quiet influence. They run charitable foundations, lead art institutions, and serve in diplomatic roles. Their names may no longer command nations, but they still open doors. Legacy creates gravity. When a family has stood for centuries, its name becomes a kind of currency. One traded in trust, in heritage, in memory. That is why the modern world still looks to royalty for fascination. Because in a society that changes too quickly, they offer the illusion of permanence. A thread that connects the present to the distant past. And perhaps that is why we still watch coronations, read about royal scandals, and debate the relevance of monarchs, not because we need them, but because we need to remember what came before us. Hidden thrones. But some bloodlines go further, hiding not only from public life, but from history itself. In France, there are families who still hold documents proving descent from Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They guard them like relics, fearing publicity. In Austria, old Habsburg estates are quietly managed by distant cousins. The names changed on paper, but the ownership unchanged in truth. In Italy, aristocrats who lost their titles during the unification still gather in private circles, maintaining traditions no one outside their world can name. And beyond Europe, the legacy of monarchy took stranger forms. In India, deposed Maharajas became industrialists. In Africa, ancient dynasties still passed down titles informally through oral lineage. Even in the Middle East, tribal leaders trace their descent from rulers lost to time. Across every continent, the same pattern repeats. Power hides in blood, not in crowns. The world no longer bows, but the lineage persists. The myth lives on every generation, rediscovers the fascination with royal secrets. New films, documentaries, and novels resurrect the same question. What if one of them survived? Because buried inside that question is a deeper truth. We want to believe that something endures beyond politics, beyond revolutions, beyond time. That history, however violent, cannot erase the people who shaped it. The Romanovs, the Bourbons, the Habsburgs, the Tudors, their names return like echoes. Even when history buries them, storytelling resurrects them. Every time we tell their stories, their bloodline survives once more, through memory, myth, and fascination. The modern monarchs, today's royals, walk a narrow line between past and future. They live not as rulers, but as symbols, and yet those symbols hold immense weight. When Queen Elizabeth II passed, millions mourned a figure they never met, not because of personal attachment, but because she represented continuity in an uncertain world. When a royal wedding is televised, billions watch, not for politics, but for the story of lineage carried forward. In a strange way, we have all become part of the monarchy's mythology. We follow it, debate it, criticize it, and by doing so, we keep it alive. The royal idea now exists not in castles, but in consciousness, a shared belief that some stories never end. The return of the blood. But the story doesn't stop with symbols. There are whispers, credible, documented and otherwise, that some hidden heirs still exist, living completely outside the spotlight. A man in Buenos Aires claiming descent from a lost branch of the Romanovs. A woman in France with birth certificates linking her to the Bourbons. An aristocratic family in Canada whose genealogy leads back to the Habsburgs. Some are proven, others remain speculation. But each claim keeps the legend alive, the belief that royal blood still moves through the modern world. It's not about thrones anymore. It's about legacy, the invisible inheritance of history itself, the eternal circle. History repeats itself, but it never repeats cleanly. Every revolution gives birth to new hierarchies. Every collapse creates new elites. And every time we believe the age of kings is over, we find new ways to crown our idols, with fame, with fortune, with influence. Perhaps the royal bloodline was never about genealogy. Perhaps it was always about memory. Because memory, like blood, survives everything. The crowns have fallen, the empires have turned to dust. But the people, the descendants, the legacies, remain. They live beside us, among us, within us. And as long as we tell their stories, the bloodline never truly dies. Epilogue. If you walk the streets of Vienna, you can still hear echoes of waltzes from another age. If you stand in London, the bells of Westminster remind you that some traditions refuse to fade. And if you look closely, in the names on plaques, in the families who never left their estates, in the quiet grace of certain strangers, you will find that history still breathes among us. The crowns are gone, but the blood remembers. It always has. It always will. Because power doesn't vanish. It simply changes its disguise. And the royal bloodline, the one we thought ended long ago, still flows quietly beneath the surface of our world. Night falls differently in the places where kings once ruled. The air is heavier, the silence deeper, as if the walls themselves remember. Walk through the ruins of a castle at dusk, and you can almost hear it. Not footsteps, not voices, but something quieter, an echo. The echo of names that history pretends to forget. They said the monarchies were dead. They said bloodlines were broken, scattered, irrelevant. But blood doesn't listen to politics. Blood remembers. And even when nations erase their kings, the line refuses to vanish. It hides in new names, new countries, new generations. The thrones are gone, but the inheritance, that ancient gravity, still moves unseen beneath the surface of our modern world. There are houses, quiet and unmarked, where the portraits of ancestors are turned to the wall. Not because the families are ashamed, but because memory is dangerous. A forgotten prince lives as a schoolteacher. A queen's great-granddaughter works in a law firm. They walk among us unnoticed, their history folded neatly behind ordinary smiles. Yet, when they dream of marble corridors, of candlelight, of voices calling them by names the world no longer knows. In every century, humanity believes it has escaped its past. But power never truly dies. It merely changes costume. Once it wore crowns of gold. Now it wears tailored suits, titles, and signatures at the bottom of contracts. The faces of influence have changed, but the pattern remains the same. Inheritance, hierarchy, legacy. Look closely enough, and you can still trace the same families, the same names whispering through time, behind the banks, the palaces, the governments. Always there, always waiting. They say the Romanovs were executed, every last one. And yet rumors persist. A photograph surfaces. A strand of DNA whispers otherwise. The truth is blurred, and perhaps that's how it's meant to be. Because history's greatest secret is not what was lost, but what was allowed to survive. In the archives of Europe lie sealed letters, never opened. In private vaults, heirlooms traded from one generation to the next. in the depths of old estates, genealogies that have not been spoken aloud in 100 years. Every piece a clue, every record a confession. Together they form a quiet truth. The royal bloodline never died. It simply learned to whisper. We think of history as something finished, a story already told. But what if history is still happening, just out of sight? What if the same blood that once ruled continents now signs laws, writes books, buys companies, and makes decisions that shape the lives of millions? Would we recognize it? Would we care? Or would we prefer not to know? There's a reason myths of lost heirs never fade. They are not just stories. They are memories of power refusing to die. We tell them because they remind us that lineage is not about thrones. It's about continuity, about the haunting idea that who we were still lingers in who we are. Somewhere tonight, a child is born into a family with a secret. They will grow up unaware that their veins carry the residue of empires. One day, they'll wonder why strangers stare at their face, why old portraits seem familiar, why certain names stir something unexplainable inside them. And perhaps in that moment they'll feel it, that ancient echo moving quietly through time. It will whisper to them as it has whispered for centuries, remember. Because the blood never forgets. So the question remains, did monarchy truly end? Or did it simply evolve, beyond the reach of our eyes, beyond the walls of palaces, into something quieter, older, and far more enduring? Perhaps the royal bloodline is not a myth of the past, but a map of the present. You cannot see it, but it's there. In the hands that write, in the voices that decide, in the names that never fade. It lives in shadows, inherited, protected, eternal. And as long as power exists, as long as history refuses to die, so too will the bloodline, hidden, silent, immortal.